Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. Just going to wait a few seconds. There's a lot of people still coming in. Oh, my cats are scratching at the door. I'm sure you guys can hear. I'm so sorry. All right. I think I'll let everybody in. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming for our last session of the DC Master Gardener Continuing Education Series 2021. We're here today with Arielle Conti from DOEE. She's going to be talking about rain gardens. And I know a lot of people are excited about this presentation because we sold out. We had more than 100 people sign up. So thank you so much. Really excited. Type your questions in the chat box. We're going to have some time at the end for questions, and I'm going to hand it over to Arielle.
All righty, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining this evening. I am Arielle Conti. Let me get this. All right, there we go. That looks good, right? Okay. Yeah, thanks again. Thanks for joining us. My name is Arielle Conti. I work for the Department of Energy and Environment, our RiverSmart Homes program. I am not officially representing the government today, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have about rain gardens, about residential incentive programs, yeah, the one other thing I'll say is that I've been a resident of the district for 12 years and been with district government for about 2 years. Before that, I was working with some local nonprofits on stormwater issues and native plant habitats. I'm a certified arborist, and I'm so happy to be with you guys today. So yeah, I'll jump right in. As Patricia mentioned, please, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat, and then we will have some time at the end to talk a little bit more about, or to answer your questions. So yeah, we're going to discuss stormwater, what it is, why it's an issue, and then we're going to talk about some solutions, green infrastructure solutions to stormwater, specifically rain gardens. What is a rain garden? How do we design a rain garden? We'll talk a little bit about installations. I'm not going to get too technical, but I did want to go over some points about installing rain gardens. And then, yeah, I'll talk a little bit about local incentive programs, specifically the RiverSmart rebates. Seeing as yesterday was Indigenous People Day, and we're talking about land restoration and land and soils, I wanted to just do a quick acknowledgement that Washington, D.C. is located on Nacotchtank land, which was anglicized to be Anacostia, and eventually hence the name of the Anacostia River. And eventually those tribes actually combined with the Piscataway, with the Piscataway. So just a quick land acknowledgement, and now we'll talk about stormwater. All right, stormwater is one of the biggest pollutants to our streams and rivers. Stormwater, for those who are not familiar, is excessive rainfall that does not soak into the ground, but instead flows over the land's hard surface into the nearest water body through storm drains and channels, right? So when rain hits your roof or any hard surface, it runs down your downspouts, it runs downhill towards the storm drains. As it moves downhill, it picks up all sorts of pollutants, right? Pet waste, fertilizer, debris, trash, motor oil, sediment is a really big one in the district. And again, that water then gets pumped through our storm drains and eventually heads out into the Anacostia, the Potomac, or Rock Creek. And so stormwater is one of the biggest issues we have in the district in terms of pollutants to our rivers. And it's because we have a huge amount of impervious surface, right? 43% of the district is actually impervious. So you can see in the middle there, we've got a map of the district. Those darker gray areas are going to be your more densely populated, or sorry, more densely paved areas. And the lighter spots are going to be the areas where you see lots of tree canopy or or the rivers, right? So you can see the Anacostia running through DC, you can see Rock Creek and Rock Creek Park, the buffer to the creek up in Northwest. You guys can see here a single 1.2 inch storm event in DC produces about 525 million gallons of stormwater runoff, right? And that's all eventually ending up in our rivers. And now let me just give the caveat that some of it is going to Blue Plains to be processed to our stormwater treatment plant. But on these large storm events, our stormwater system can't handle, or our sewer system can't handle that amount of water. And so they're basically just outflowing, that water's then outflowing into the rivers without being treated. You guys know that some of the nuisances related to stormwater, but you can see here one of the biggest ones is flooding. This is actually somebody who reached out to me on Newton Street Northeast after one of our big storms in September. We've had a number of them. I'm going to talk a bit about the typical storm in DC and what that really means. But I just really want to emphasize the fact that this is an issue that's not going away. It's only going to get worse as we continue to develop and as storms continue to get more intense, more frequent storms, more intense storms. And so when we talk about rain gardens, we're really talking about a strategy to climate resilience, right? We know the district is going to continue to have larger storms and more intense storms. And so one way we can combat that is through different types of green infrastructure, and specifically through rain gardens. Now, these are bowl-shaped gardens that are directly connected to your downspout in some cases. In some cases, like where you see them along the streets in public right-of-way or in parking lots, those are going to be managing water that's either coming off of that hard surface, right? We call that sheet flow. So when you see a large bioretention or a large rain garden downslope of a parking lot, usually there's an inlet or a curb cut that's directing the water into one place in that bioretention space. And I do just want to back up a little bit. There is some terminology as I talk about rain gardens. If I use the term bioretention or best management practice or LID, low impact development, I'm meaning all of the same thing. And that's essentially a space where we're managing stormwater so that it can infiltrate into the ground. I'll try to stick to rain garden or best management practice, but just know that we have a lot of different names for kind of a similar features. So yeah, rain garden, bowl-shaped garden that in most cases is directly connected to a downspout, right? So it's managing all of that water that's coming off of a roof. Or in some cases, and we'll see this later today, you've got water that's being piped through a French drain and letting out into a bioretention or a rain garden space, or like I said, in places like public right-of-way, you'll see water that's directed in just from the street. Regardless, they're bowl-shaped gardens. I get it. We've amended the soil, right? So a huge part of rain gardens is that we're digging down at least 24 inches and we're amending that soil with a lot of sand, mostly, so that water can infiltrate in. The whole point of rain gardens is to hold water in place so that the water can slowly infiltrate down into the subsoil, eventually recharging groundwater. I'm going to say for now. Here's a cross section of a rain garden so you can get a sense of some of the main features, and I'll be talking about these in a little more detail later, but did want to point out a few things. So right here, you've got your downspout extension right? So the area where your water is coming out is going to be right here. And you see this outflow, it's called outflow protection. It's essentially just river rock usually. And what this does is as the water is flowing out of the downspout, it's dissipating that hydrologic pressure, right? It's basically slowing the water down so that as it moves into the rain garden, it's not blowing out those plants that we just put in. And so this is particularly important for newly planted gardens, but anytime you have a rain garden, you really want some protection by the downspout extension or essentially wherever the water's coming in. And that can look lots of different ways. I'll show you again later on an example of almost like a step pool where it looks like a waterfall where the downspout is letting out. We also have scenarios where we have things called forebays. So like essentially a large area of strong, hardy, usually grasses, but strong, hardy plants that'll help dissipate the water before it reaches the rain garden or the other plants, essentially. The other important thing I'm going to be talking about a bunch is this berm. So you can see that a rain garden has this, as I mentioned, this bowl-shaped garden. And really it's almost trying to replicate a riparian zone, right? So if you think of your rain garden, especially if you're thinking about installing a rain garden or planting a rain garden, you can think about it almost as a riparian zone, right? So you've got your water-loving plants in the middle here, those things that'll do really well when their feet get and stay wet for a significant period of time. And then you've got your more drought-tolerant plants up on the edges or on the banks, if you will. Let me see, how do I erase? And as I mentioned before, an important piece is this ponding depth. So I'm going to highlight that for you here. It's from the top of the berms and then essentially till the top of the soil, right? So water can sit on top, almost in this bowl shape, be held there as it's infiltrating down. And then again, you've got that, in this example, we've got 18 inches of amended soil. Sometimes it's up to 24 inches of amended soil. And then underneath, you've got your in situ soils, right? Which hopefully don't have a lot of clay in them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. The other thing I wanted to say about rain gardens here. That's all. So let's talk a little bit about designing your rain garden. There's some really important things to keep in mind when you're designing a rain garden, either for a residential space, that's kind of what I'll be focusing on, but these are true throughout any size rain garden that you're thinking about building. So you want it to be at least 10 feet from any foundation. Again, this goes back to the hydrologic pressure. If we had a rain garden that was right up against your foundation, you're holding water in place right up against your foundation, you're gonna have issues, right? We don't want that water to be held in place right up against there. We don't want you to have any issues, any water flooding issues in your basement related to this. So it's incredibly important that that rain garden is located at least 10 feet away from any foundation. Now, that's not just your foundation, it's a garage or a neighbor's foundation. You don't want it at the lowest point of the property. And this is kind of something that's maybe not super intuitive for a lot of people, right? They think, oh, they look at their property and they say, this is where all of my water already sits. Why don't I just put a rain garden here? It'll be perfect. It's already essentially used as a rain garden. Well, the really important thing to keep in mind with rain gardens is that they're engineered spaces and they're designed for a typical storm event. So in the DC area, that's a 1.2 inch storm event. Now, again, we know that we have a lot of storm events that are significantly heavier rainfall, where we get significantly more than 1.2 inches of rain. And so what we want to think about is what happens to that water if we're designing a rain garden, the lowest point of the property. What happens to that water if the rain garden isn't able to manage that full storm? Where does it go? And so that's one of the reasons that when we're locating where we want the rain garden to go, we want to make sure we think about where that water could leave from. Is it being directed onto the sidewalk? That's not great. Is it being directed onto your driveway? Also not something you want. So putting it kind of almost usually in the middle of a slope is really great, because you can hold that water as it's coming down slope. If there's more water than the rain garden can handle, it can continue on. We'll talk a little bit more about some examples and what that looks like. It's incredibly important that the rain garden is downslope from a downspout or any directed water flow, right? As we know, water flows downhill. We need that water to be going towards the rain garden. We don't want that garden located under a large canopy tree. Why is that? Because we're digging down 18 to 24 inches. We don't want to sever any of those large roots. So if you're within the critical root zone of a large tree, that's going to be an issue. You're either going to have to do some really careful excavation, which is totally possible, or you're going to have to put it somewhere else. You just don't want to sever those roots as you're digging down, because trees, as we know, are also great stormwater management tools. And so in addition, it's like putting two stormwater management tools on top of each other. And in some ways they're negating each other, right? Because if there's a canopy over the top of a rain garden, that water is already slowing down and dissipating, and in some instances moving towards down the branches towards the trunk of the tree and being absorbed by those tree roots. And so if we want to get the most bang for our buck in terms of stormwater management, we'll move that rain garden out from under the large tree canopy, if it's possible. And then the last thing to think about is how permeable are your soils? As I mentioned earlier, we don't want soils that are super clayey. So and we'll talk a little bit more about percolation tests, but essentially if you're digging down and your water doesn't percolate, then we're going to have an issue, right? Because we are amending the top 24 inches or 18 inches of soil, but underneath that, if you have this dense clay layer, then water's not going to be able to infiltrate down. And again, you're basically making a pond, and that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for water to be able to, as I mentioned, recharge into the groundwater, into the subsoil. So have to have somewhat permeable soils underneath the rain garden and around it. Okay, let's talk about sizing our rain gardens. We like to use a 10-to-1 rule. It's the simplest way of sizing a rain garden. And that 10-to-1 rule looks at the impervious surface area, or the treatment area, as being, the rain garden is going to be at a 10-to-1 ratio with the size of the impervious surface area or the treatment area. So what that means is if you have a 500 square foot roof, being directed into a downspout that's going into a rain garden, your rain garden is going to be 50 square feet. Now that's assuming a 6-inch ponding depth. So if you're crunched for space and you don't have 50 square feet, but you have 30 square feet that you could work with, you can always make that ponding depth deeper, right? You can make those berms a little bit higher, and then you're going to get the same volume water volume retention without out the same square footage. But a good rule of thumb is 10 to 1. And we'll just look at an example here. So this example is going to come up a little bit later. It's 3050 Monroe Street Northeast. This is somebody who is very gung-ho about managing all of their stormwater on site. When they moved to their house, they put a bunch of rain barrels in, they put a small rain garden in on their roof, and their downspout was actually on this side of the house. And then they realized a huge amount of their stormwater was actually coming from their neighbor's 1,600 square foot patio. So this huge space, plus any water that was running off of their roof onto the patio, so that's where a huge amount of the water was actually spilling off onto their yard. So it was 1,600 square feet, plus 250 square feet over here. There was a downspout right here that was connected to the rain garden. And we'll talk a little bit more about this example later, but essentially there was a French drain that was piped into the rain garden here from the 1,600 square feet. So you have 1,600 square feet plus 250 is going to be 1,850 square feet of hard surface that were, I'm so sorry, I know that this is math and it's after work hours, but I promise you it's simple. 1,850 square feet of impervious surface that's being piped into the rain garden. So that rain garden was sized at 185 square feet. Again, 1,850 square feet of hard surface was being brought into the rain garden. So we had a 185 square foot rain garden. Great. So let's talk about designing our garden in terms of plant material. I'm sure this is where you all excel. So I'm just going to give a few pointers. First, I want to just give a shout out to Montgomery County Rainscapes for putting this diagram together. They are a similar rebate program in Montgomery County that offers financial and technical assistance to homeowners to install green infrastructure on their property, similar to the RiverSmart Homes program. So going to talk a little bit about plants, right? We want natives. Again, if we're talking about climate resilience, having these spaces be both, really be both water retention spaces, places for managing stormwater, but also places for pollinators and our other non-human neighbors to use and flourish is going to be incredibly important, right? So we want natives, we want perennials. And another thing to keep in mind when you're designing rain gardens is you want the plantings to be a little bit denser. So usually we recommend about 25% more dense than you would plant your typical garden. And this is for a couple reasons, mostly because we really want those roots to, we want a lot of root mass so that a lot of space is created in that amended soil that helps infiltration. We also want those, we all know that those roots are doing tons of important work in terms of taking up pollutants. So nitrogen and phosphorus being the biggest pollutants of our rivers and the Chesapeake Bay. Planting more densely, having more root mass is going to help with that. The other thing we want to think about is planting in clusters of 3 to 5. This has more to do with folks who maybe aren't super familiar with the plants that they put in and have a harder time distinguishing between the weeds and the plants that they want. And so the plants that they meant to plant. So having clusters of different plants is going to be incredibly important. Simplify, again, same reason. you put a ton of different plants in there and you're not sure what's what, you don't want to go pulling the plants that you meant to put in there. If you're interested in adding a tree to your rain garden, we would recommend only using a small canopied tree. They shade out, they take up a large amount of the root space, and they can be better suited elsewhere. If you do put a rain garden, if you do put a tree in your rain garden, putting it on the edges is going to be the key. And oftentimes I like to put it downslope. So you have your rain garden and you have that place where if you have a large storm event, the water is going to outflow out of the rain garden. Having a tree there that likes to get wet can be really helpful, because then you're using the outflow from the rain garden to water that tree. It could take up some of that water as it's moving downhill. You do decide to plant a tree in your rain garden, I would highly recommend putting a good amount of ground cover underneath. And as you all know, taking a look at the such sun and shade regime in your garden and in different parts of the rain garden is going to be really important when choosing plants, right? So what's going to do well on the north side of your rain garden or upslope of your rain garden might not do as well on the south side or downslope of your rain garden. And then the last part is the aesthetics, right? The height of the plants, the color, the texture. Are you looking for more grasses? Are you looking for more pollinators? Do you want, right? Are you designing it with lots of different layers? So make sure you've got your shrub layer and your herbaceous and then your ground cover layer. Now, I'm not going to go into which plants to plant where. There's plenty of resources out there for that. I'm more than happy to share some in the chat later. The two or the three that I use most often are going to be the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professionals actually put out a really nice guide. You do have to pay for it, but it has plants that are specific to best management practices, to stormwater management practices. And so they're not only giving you information about color, seasonality, height, those kinds of things that you'll see in normal guides, but it's also giving you information about where they could best be placed within the rain garden. Do they want to be in the middle? Do they want to be on the berm? That kind of thing. And then the National Fish and Wildlife's Chesapeake Bay Native Plant Guide, which you may all be familiar with, is a great resource. And Chesapeake Natives has a good online resource that you can access, and those are both free. So again, more than happy to share those. Let's talk a little bit about installing our rain gardens. So I've talked a bit about soil amendments. Again, when we're installing a rain garden, we're digging down, we're amending 18 to 24 inches, and a huge portion of that is going to be sand. So usually we recommend about 65% sand, 20% top soil, and 15% compost. Now, these are the numbers that we use with RiverSmart Homes and residential properties. These are not by any means the end all be all. So if you are designing your own garden and you don't have, you aren't able to mix in 65% sand, if you only have 60 or 55%, that's not a big deal. But the whole point is that it does need to be incredibly sandy soils. And we need the clay content to be less than 10%. So you guys all know a ton about soils, clay, those smaller particles, they're denser, water can't infiltrate down, right? So we can't have a high clay content. And then the last thing is just to talk a little bit about percolation rate. So before installing, the soil should have a drawdown rate of 1.2 inches per hour and must drain within 36 hours. And so you can see over here in the picture, we have a hole that's been dug. This is actually for a percolation test. I'm more than happy to share our worksheet on how to conduct a percolation test if folks don't know. But you dig a hole, again, down to the depth that your rain garden is going to be. And you fill it all the way up with water, let it drain fully out, and then you fill it up again. And essentially you take markings every hour, how quickly that water is drawing down, how quickly is that water infiltrating down. And you want it to be infiltrating at 1.2 inches per hour. And you want it to be fully drained out within 36 hours. We have a lot of clay soils in DC, so it's not uncommon to see percolation tests that don't drain after 36 hours. The other important thing I want to talk about is leveling, right? For a rain garden, you really want that bed of the garden to be perfectly flat. And this is because when the garden is filling up with water, you want the entire ponding depth to be able to fill up. If you're at an angle, you're not going to have that nice level water rise. You want it to essentially be like a bathtub. And so you can see that diagram on the left. You're looking at a couple of different sloped areas and the way to make sure your rain garden is level if you're doing installation. And so 2 sticks and tying a string across, making sure it's level, and then measuring throughout the garden once you've dug down to make sure it's the same distance from the string to the base of that garden all the way across. The important thing to think about when installing your rain garden is, yes, it's going to be more work to dig down on a steep slope, and you're also going to have a really large berm on the downhill slope. So you're really going to have to build up that one side of your rain garden if you've got a steep slope. So yeah, in this case, this berm would be particularly high. Just something to think about from an aesthetic point of view. And then I like this image on the right because it does show how nice and level this fire retention space is. This is actually outside of my office on 1st and M Street Northeast. Looks very different now. It's totally grown in, tons of vegetation. These river birches are huge. But you can see here, there's these curb cuts. And this is basically, and this area is what we call a forebay. So essentially water's coming down off of this sidewalk here. Kind of moving into this space. And as it does that, the velocity of the water is being dissipated, right? Because there's gravel here, there's some tough grasses, there's this river birch, and then it's letting out into the rain garden through these 3 curb cuts. It's just a nice example of a rain garden in public right of way. Let's talk a little bit about berms, outflows, and mulch, which are things that I've mentioned, but are important factors. So berm is this edge around the outside, especially on the downslope. It's incredibly important to install because, right, that's really what's keeping that bowl shape in place. It's what's keeping the water in that bowl so that it doesn't just spill out over the edges. Oftentimes the way that we construct berms on residential properties is just by taking some of that excavated soil, building up around, especially around the downslope, but around the outside of that rain garden, and tamping it down so that it's super compacted. And then you can see putting mulch over it. That's the easiest way to do it. I've also seen constructed berms with other materials. So there's other ways of doing it, but essentially having that block so that water can't just spill over is important for a rain garden design. Outflow is something that I've been mentioning too. So that's the area where the water can go once the rain garden fills up. In this case, it's going to be this stone area here. So water will flow out of the rain garden and across this lawn. For the one on the left, it doesn't have a direct point, but the way that this rain garden is situated, it's on a slope. So water is actually coming down through the downspout, out right over here. And then after the rain garden fills up, it's just going to come out this way on the downhill slope. And hopefully some of it will be absorbed into this grass area before it flows into the road. And then, yeah, lastly, mulching. It's incredibly important to have mulch in your gardens, nutrient, water retention, and we usually recommend 2 to 3 inches of mulch all across your rain garden. And lastly, local incentive programs. So again, the RiverSmart Homes program is for DC residents. You don't have to own your home to take advantage of it. You also, to qualify for the RiverSmart Homes rain garden rebate, you don't actually have to have a residential property, but, and we can talk a little bit more about what that could look like. The rebate is $3 per square foot. You're looking at up to $2,200 to install a rain garden. And we need to make sure that you have 400 square feet minimum treatment area. That means you need at least 400 square feet of roof or sheet flow flowing into that rain garden. And so I'm more than happy to talk to folks or answer questions about how the rebate program works. It's fairly simple. There are plenty of resources online. You can go ahead and take a look at that website that I've put in on the slide. And if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. And last but not least, I wanted to show this adorable video of that rain garden that I mentioned before, that 185 square foot rain garden at 3050 Monroe Street. So we can take a look at it in action, right? We have the resident, Joe Abrams' daughter, playing in the rain garden. You can see in the outflow. Now she's stomping around through the plants, but not stepping on any of them. You can see the water is flowing out nicely. We've got a nice level ponding depth behind her. You can see the berm almost. We've planted natives in here. So you've got some phlox, some echinacea, some rudbeckia. We've got hydrangeas in there. We've got lobelia. There's a river birch down at the bottom here. Yeah, that's the oak leaf hydrangea. And then we're gonna pan up in just a minute and take a look at where the water is coming from. So yeah, again, this is the outflow. The downspout's just underneath that rock. You can see this step pool feature, which is really quite lovely when it's raining out. And this again is the garden that is managing that 1,600 square foot patio, the neighbor's patio, as well as a small roof area on the property. There's plenty of outflow. So on the other side of the rain garden, which you can't see, there's tons of grass space. You can see some of the phlox that was planted. And as we're moving up towards, you can see where the water was actually piped into this drain. Again, some gravel was put here to help slow the water down before it goes into this French drain and then gets piped out. at the end. We're just going to have one more view of it. There's the 1,650 square foot patio. There's the rain coming off of it. And I think we're going to turn around with our camera any minute now. Yeah, take a look at the garden from this angle. So there you have it. A lovely example of a rain garden in action. That's all I've got for you today. I know it was a lot of information and I have not been looking at the chat, so I will stop. Oh, there we go. I'll look at the chat now. Okay. Oh, source for the impervious surface. This was Octo aerial imagery. It's from Open Data DC. I think it was DDOT's flyover in maybe 2018. I can double check that for you, George. There's a big project to improve stormwater runoff in Bloomingdale along Rhode Island. Could you talk about that? Yeah, I'm more than happy to talk about that. So if you guys have been at in Bloomingdale and driven through Rhode Island Ave, you'll know that right at 7th Street, basically can't drive through there anymore. They're digging a huge tunnel. So you guys may have heard of the Anacostia Tunnel. This is essentially a place to hold a ton of stormwater. So I mentioned earlier, our sewer system can't handle the amount of water that it's getting. That's because we've increased the impervious surface so much over the years. And a way that we're trying to engineer our way out of that issue is by building these huge metro-sized tunnels that literally just hold stormwater and sewage water during a storm event, so that it can then be redirected to blue plans, to our wastewater treatment plant after the storm, right? Because I mentioned earlier, the wastewater treatment plant can't handle the volume of water that it's getting during a large storm event. So if we hold that water in place in these large underground containers and then have it slowly let out to blue plans, we will see a decrease in the water that's getting into our rivers, the polluted water that's getting into our rivers. So maybe I didn't describe this well enough, but essentially now, there's two different sewer systems. There's the MS4 sewer system in DC, which is kind of the outside of DC. In that area, all of your stormwater is piped directly into the rivers. So there's no getting around it. In the MS4, your stormwater is going straight into the rivers. In the center of DC, you've got the combined sewer system, and that's where your wastewater and your stormwater are combining in the same pipes and then going to blue plains. Now, those combined pipes are then unable to handle the volume of water that they're getting. So during large storm events, that wastewater and that stormwater are then outflowing into our rivers. So you're getting raw sewage. That's when you get raw sewage going into our rivers. In order to prevent this, we're basically creating these holding tanks. It's part of DC Water's large we call it gray infrastructure plan. There's tons of money going into it. It's why your water bills are so high. Our water bills. Incentives for community gardens. So that rebate that I talked about at the end, you can use if you have a community garden, if you have a shelter that's directly managing water. So if you have a downspout, or if you can basically show us that there's enough sheet flow going to a rain garden. So you can take advantage of that $3 per square foot. If you're a community garden, we also have Department of Energy and Environment has these community stormwater solutions grants. So if you have a compelling project, you can put in for that. They're anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000, and we put them out every 2 years. So they are competitive, but they can be a good option if you have a big project and partners. Yes, Patricia, I'll send you the presentation so that you can send it to everybody. The rain gardens cause mosquitoes. One of my favorite questions. No, they do not. That's the 36-hour draining requirement. So mosquitoes breed after 72 hours. You're going to have that water infiltrate into the ground after 36 hours. Mosquitoes won't be able to breed. Now, that's one of the reasons that we're so strict about making sure there's not too much clay in the soil, about making sure that that water can percolate down. It's a very common question. Yes. Yes. Cheryl, you're right. Rain gardens are not the only solution. Yeah, I talked a little bit about gray infrastructure and the pipes. We also have public right-of-way infrastructure. So I showed a little bit of that in front of my office building, but you'll see them all along the streets, all over Golden Triangle downtown, but also in public right-of-ways. And that's all I'll say about that. Okay, this question is about the different sewer systems, which hopefully I answered this. Hopefully I answered Patricia Nelson's question. Yep. And does it mean you can't have a rain garden if your yard is mostly clay? So it means that if you have a rain garden and your yard is mostly clay, that you can do a couple of things, right? You may have clay just at the first couple inches, and when you dig down, it might not be as bad. So there's that. But if you, as I said earlier, if you have a ton of clay in your soil and you want to put a rain garden in, just know that you are either going to have to size that rain garden a little bit bigger so that the water can infiltrate in at the rate that you need it to. That would probably be the easiest solution. Or you're gonna have to dig down deeper and amend more soil. Do the gardens attract snakes? I've heard this and our other furry friends, our other city kitties. No, not that I know of. The critters that we don't want around in our yards are looking for food, right? And yes, they will be attracted to more dense brush, but if you already, I haven't heard any issues with snakes, but if you already have issues with rats, then putting a rain garden is not going to make that any worse. That's what I will say. I have not heard about rain gardens attracting snakes, but yeah, it's an interesting question. Cheryl, I'm not sure I understand this question of a mowing edge. Maybe you can elaborate. Either take yourself off mute if you can, or just type in a little more detail. All right, UDC's Birdie Bacchus bioretention site at Hamlin, South Dakota has this is Bermuda grass. Edge that creeps into the retention site. Oh, yeah, this is one of the, this is one of the reasons that we recommend having that mulched berm and that compacted berm around the outside. But I have heard of some really innovative rain garden bioretention spaces that don't actually use soil medium. Instead, they're trying to get really creative about how to use more like rocks and craggy medium and get plants that are more suited or adapted to that environment to try to help with the weeds. It's something that we're looking into with one of our innovation grants to see if it might help with this issue. Can we apply to install a rain garden in our devil strip? Unfortunately, no, that's Department of Transportation, and they have all of their, the devil strip is that space between the sidewalk and the road, where your street trees are. And yeah, it's technically public right of way, technically Department of Transportation. And so even if it's not slated for a tree, they do own that property. And if they are planning on putting a rain garden there, they will do it. They'll take up that space or maybe even do a bump out into a parking space. This is very contentious, but happens. But you can take a look at Department of Transportation's their green infrastructure program, and you can try to reach out to them and see if they have plans to put a rain garden or what they call bioretention along your street. Okay, yep, I think George, you asked this question about, is the berm built or undisturbed soil? And as I mentioned earlier, it is excavated soil that's then built up and compacted down. Does the first and M location still have the need for mowing edge that's depicted? No. I think, again, maybe I'm not totally sure what you mean by the mowing edge, but I think you're talking about the forebay. And no, that's not the case. It's basically all sea oats now. And that small river birch is now like 3 to 4 caliper inches on all 3 stems, and it's throwing up a huge amount of shade, and it's probably 30 feet tall. So that's an old picture. Does mulch need to be applied every year? I've seen native plantings being inhibited by mulch. Some native plant specialists don't recommend mulch because of this. Yeah, there's actually, yeah, I appreciate that question. There is a big debate about how much mulch, and really we recommend the 2 to 3 inches of mulch for the first year, or 3 seasons, depending on when the garden is planted. And that's really to help with water retention while the plants are getting established. And then afterwards, it's less important. So yeah, because you've got more of that root area, you've got more biomass above the surface. And so you're able to, yeah, you're not as dependent on the mulch. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm sure if you haven't gotten my email yet and you wanted it, you can ask. All right. Mold management methods in rain gardens. Like moldy soils? I haven't heard of this being as much of an issue, and that is because drainage should be so good. But I'm curious if anybody else has thoughts about mold management or mold management methods in rain gardens. Most rain gardens are more bare in the winter, but one of the important things to think about is like which of those species are going to be evergreen, are going to have foliage all year round. And so oftentimes when we're designing rain gardens, we're making sure that there is going to be some interest throughout the year. But yeah, it's going to look more bare in the winter. Thanks, Megan. Does DC mandate rain gardens on properties where an old house is bulldozed and a new bigger one is constructed, raising the land level by at least 20 inches? Helen, great question. There are tons of regulations in DC when you're doing new construction, or if you're disturbing more than 500 square feet of soil. So you always have to do a soil erosion control plan, and there are regulated stormwater management plan. So you don't have to do a rain garden. So if you're a developer and you're coming in and building up a huge condo, you have to manage your stormwater. And so the way that we do that is by either requiring that the developer manages all their stormwater on site, or they pay into a pot of money that allows bioretention to be built elsewhere in the city to manage stormwater. So a certain amount has to be managed on site. Some of it can go into a fund to manage stormwater elsewhere.
Could I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, absolutely.
Assume it's not a developer, it's just an owner. And of course,
Same
there's
thing.
a developer involved and they could care less. But this is happening next door to me. And so I'm having trouble going through all the DCRA plans and everything. And I'm certainly happy to share your video with the owner when the owner takes over. But I mean, all of the downspouts of this massive new house are aimed out, and they're already destroying the water flow and causing problems. They've killed 2 ewes on my property. So this rain garden seems like a really good solution, but can it be, I mean, who do I go to? Do I go to DDOT? Do I go to DCRA, or just hope?
It is a DCRA issue, and I can give you the contact information of the woman who manages the permits for stormwater issues. So yeah, send me a quick email and I'll connect you to Nikita.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. But to answer your question, they are still regulated. If they're doing a certain amount, and it sounds like they are, if they're doing a certain amount of construction on site and changing the footprint, they are required to manage stormwater on site, and that can look lots of different ways. Permeable pavers seem to be very popular with developers. They get their parking spot. Yeah, no problem. But yeah, stormwater in residential areas, stormwater needs to be managed on site. So if they're pointing pipes towards your house, then there can be a fine associated with that. While your rain garden is growing in, can you stick annuals in empty spaces? Absolutely. Absolutely. You want to brighten that up, go for it. I would highly recommend that. It's not gonna ruin anything, but the base of the heart of the rain garden should be perennials, native perennials. Any good online training programs for rain garden construction? So I mentioned the Chesapeake Bay Landscape Professionals. They do a good intro course on natives to the Chesapeake Bay, managing stormwater, kind of like a nice overview. If you're looking for more specific on like the nuts and bolts of installing rain gardens, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I know there's a ton out there. And I'm more than happy to follow up with you if you send me an email. Our neighbor applied together, such as sidewalk, devil strip, street, stormwater management. Again, yeah, this was asked earlier. You can, if you have a neighbor that wants to install a stormwater management practice and it crosses over your property lines, that's totally fine. We just need, for the RiverSmart Homes program, we just need confirmation from both neighbors that you're okay with it. As I mentioned earlier, sidewalk, devil strip, street, that's all Department of Transportation, and we can't touch that. And yeah. Oh, sorry, Cheryl, you can unmute. Can you use plants that can serve more than one purpose? Good for rain garden and mosquito repellent. Yes, absolutely. And I love that idea. I also like the idea of using plants that are both really good, like nitrogen fixers or phosphorus fixers, and also good stormwater retainers. Yeah, huge churches. Lilla, RiverSmart Communities. So it's our sister program, and it helps retrofit churches with a lot of these practices. And so again, it's an application process, but not quite as competitive as the community stormwater solution project or grant. And if you have any specific churches that you would like to be part of the program, please send them our way. Again, RiverSmart Communities is that program, and we will install green infrastructure for free on churches. Again, it's a competitive process. I know I'm done.
There's one last question that someone even said, please answer this person's question. I heard that it's illegal to collect rainwater like in containers. Is that true?
Say that again?
I heard that it is illegal to collect rainwater like in containers. Is that true?
If they're open containers, I wouldn't recommend it. I haven't heard that, but they are going to be mosquito breeding grounds if they're not properly.
That makes sense. Okay. Thank you so much. That was great. Oh my goodness. So many questions in the chat. I can see everyone's so engaged. I really appreciate you coming out, Arielle. This was wonderful. If you will send me your slides, that would be great. I'll email them out to everybody with the recording when it's up on YouTube in a few days. Thank you everyone for coming, and have a great night.
Thank you guys.
Good night.
Everybody, thank you.